The lights went out just before midnight. Again. 16-year-old Ethan Carter stood in the doorway of the barn, watching the last ceiling bulb flicker twice before the entire building disappeared into darkness. A second later, the ventilation fans stopped. The water pump fell silent. From inside the stalls came the restless sounds of animals shifting in the heat. Ethan did not need to check the house. He already knew what he would find. His mother would be searching for candles. His younger sister would be holding a flashlight beneath her chin, pretending she was not afraid. And his father would be walking toward the old diesel generator, carrying the same red fuel can they could barely afford to refill. Power failures were common on the Carter farm. Their property sat at the far end of an aging rural power line, where fallen branches, summer storms, and overloaded equipment could cut electricity without warning. For most families in town, an outage meant a dark evening. For the Carters, it meant losing water for the livestock, airflow in the chicken house, refrigeration for milk and vegetables, and precious hours of work. That night, the generator coughed 3 times before finally starting. A cloud of exhaust rolled across the yard as the barn lights returned. Ethan's father stared at the machine with tired eyes. "We can't keep doing this," he muttered. The generator was old. Fuel prices were rising. Repair bills were piling up. Every outage pushed the farm closer to a point from which it might never recover. Ethan looked beyond the barn toward the dark fields. On the distant hills, he could see the silhouettes of abandoned windmills standing against the moonlight. Some had missing blades. Others leaned sideways above empty wells. Most had not turned in years. People in town called them useless relics. Ethan saw something else. He had noticed that even on calm days, the grass near the ridge moved. The trees bent slightly. The wind never seemed to stop there. While everyone else complained about unreliable electricity, Ethan began asking a different question. What if the farm did not have to depend entirely on the power line? The next morning, he filled a notebook with sketches: old blades, salvaged motors, wires, batteries, and towers positioned across the property. The drawings were rough. Some made no sense yet. But for the first time in months, Ethan was not thinking about the next blackout. He was thinking about how to make sure it never happened again. The first windmill Ethan went after stood behind Mr. Miller's barn. For nearly 40 years it had pumped water for cattle. Now, it was little more than a rusted metal skeleton. 2 blades were broken, the main shaft had seized, and the tail struck the tower whenever the wind blew, producing a sharp, metallic clang. Mr. Miller had already planned to pay someone to tear it down. "You actually want that thing?" he asked, staring at Ethan as though the boy had requested permission to haul away a pile of garbage. Ethan nodded. "If you can take it apart yourself and clean up the mess, it's yours." Mr. Miller laughed. "Go ahead. Just don't blame me when it falls apart on the road." Word spread quickly that Ethan was collecting broken windmills. Before long, people began calling whenever they wanted one removed. Some stood forgotten in fields overgrown with weeds. Others leaned above wells that had dried up years ago. A few had only 3 or 4 bent blades left, jerking unevenly whenever a gust passed through. To their owners, the windmills were dangerous pieces of junk that cost money to dismantle. To Ethan, each one was a storage tower filled with usable parts. With help from his father, he hauled the machines back to the Carter farm in their aging pickup truck. They removed blades, lowered shafts, collected gears and bearings, and salvaged copper wire from old electrical attachments. Soon, the ground behind the livestock barn looked like a machinery graveyard. Bent blades rested against the fence. Sections of metal towers were stacked across the yard. Buckets overflowed with bolts, wires, springs, and rusted gears. Neighbors shook their heads whenever they passed. One man asked whether Ethan was opening a scrapyard. Another said his parents should make him spend his time on something useful. Even Ethan's father began to worry. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" he asked, as they unloaded the 6th windmill. Ethan looked at the mountain of rusted metal. "No," he admitted, "but I know not everything in there is dead." That evening, Ethan cleaned an old bearing with a wire brush. He scraped away the rust, added a few drops of oil, and tapped the housing gently with a hammer. At first, nothing happened. Then the bearing moved. Slowly, Unevenly, it began to spin again. It was only a small motion, almost meaningless to anyone else. But to Ethan, it was the first proof that the town had thrown away something that still had value. By the end of the month, Ethan had collected 9 broken windmills. They covered nearly every open space behind the barn. Rusted blades leaned against the fence, tower sections lay across the grass, and boxes of gears and wires filled one corner of the workshop. To the neighbors, the Carter farm looked worse than before. One Saturday morning, several farmers gathered at Miller's supply store. When Ethan arrived to buy bolts and electrical wire, the conversation suddenly turned toward him. "So, Ethan," one man called out, "how many lights can all that junk power?" The others laughed. Ethan placed his supplies on the counter. "None yet," he replied. That answer only made them laugh harder. Mr. Dawson, who owned one of the largest farms in the area, stepped closer. "Those windmills were built to pump water," he said. "They weren't designed to run barns or refrigerators." "I know," Ethan answered. "Then what exactly are you building?" Ethan hesitated before opening the notebook he carried everywhere. Inside were drawings of several small windmills placed across the Carter property, each one connected to a central battery bank through a network of wires and homemade controllers. "Not one big machine," Ethan explained. "A group of smaller ones working together." The room grew quiet for a moment. Then Mr. Dawson smiled. "You think 9 broken windmills are going to replace the power company?" "No," Ethan said. "I think they might keep the important equipment running when the power company fails." Someone at the back of the store muttered that the boy had been reading too many science magazines. Another man warned him that batteries were expensive, old machines were unreliable, and one strong storm could destroy everything he built. Even Mr. Miller, who had given Ethan the first windmill, shook his head. "There's a reason we stopped using those things." Ethan understood their doubts. He had no engineering degree, no expensive tools, and almost no money. Most of the parts in his yard had already failed once, but he also knew the farm could not survive forever on diesel fuel and hope. That afternoon he returned home and pinned his largest drawing to the workshop wall. At the top of the page he wrote 3 words: water, air, cold. The system did not need to power everything. It only needed to keep the water pump running, the ventilation fans turning, and the refrigeration units cold. Ethan stared at the drawing until the laughter from the supply store no longer bothered him. They thought he was trying to rebuild old windmills. He was actually trying to build the farm a second heartbeat. Ethan began by taking every windmill apart. He spread the pieces across the workshop floor and sorted them into rows: blades, shafts, gears, bearings, springs, bolts, and lengths of rusted steel. Some parts were bent beyond repair. Others looked ruined but moved again after hours of cleaning. Yet the more Ethan examined the machines, the more he realized something was missing. The old windmills had never been designed to generate electricity. Their blades had turned mechanical gears connected to long pump rods, drawing water from wells beneath the fields. They had strong towers and useful moving parts, but almost none contained a generator Ethan could connect to a battery. For the first time, the entire plan seemed to stop in front of him. He could make the blades turn, but turning alone was not enough. Ethan searched through broken equipment around the farm. He opened an abandoned ventilation fan, dismantled an old washing machine, and removed a small motor from a damaged grain conveyor. He had read that certain electric motors could produce current when spun from the outside. But knowing that in theory and making it work were 2 different things. He connected the first motor to a hand drill. Nothing happened. He spun it faster. The meter barely moved. A second motor produced voltage, but only at a speed the windmill gears could never reach. When Ethan connected it to a bulb, the light flashed once and vanished. For days he tested different combinations. A large gear created strength but turned too slowly. A smaller gear increased speed but placed too much strain on the shaft. One belt slipped. Another snapped. A bearing overheated because Ethan had tightened it too much. His father found him one evening surrounded by rejected parts. "Maybe those machines really were only meant to pump water," he said carefully. Ethan looked at the old gears. Then I need to change what their movement does. He combined a large windmill gear with a smaller pulley taken from the grain conveyor. The first increased force, the second increased speed. He connected them with a reinforced belt and mounted the salvaged motor on a wooden frame. Then he turned the windmill shaft by hand. The meter moved. Ethan turned faster. A small bulb flickered, faded, then glowed steadily. His father stepped closer. This was not a complete power system. It could not yet run a pump or charge a large battery. But Ethan had finally found the missing link between the old machines and the farm's electrical needs. No single windmill contained the answer. The towers provided height. The blades captured wind. The gears transferred force. The discarded motor transformed that movement into electricity. The town had seen 9 broken machines. Ethan was beginning to see one machine scattered across 9 different places. Ethan built the first windmill on a low tower behind the workshop. It was not tall enough to catch the strongest wind, but it was close to the tools, batteries, and wires he might need if something went wrong. The blades were made from 4 salvaged metal panels, carefully cut and balanced. A repaired shaft connected them to a small generator taken from another abandoned machine. For 3 days, the wind barely moved. The blades turned slowly, stopped, then turned again. The generator produced enough electricity to charge a small battery, but not enough to run any of the farm's essential equipment. Still, Ethan refused to call it a failure. He adjusted the angle of the blades. He replaced one gear with a smaller one. He tightened the loose frame and waited. On the 4th afternoon, the weather changed. Dark clouds gathered above the fields, and a steady wind began to sweep across the farm. The blades started turning faster. Ethan connected the battery to a lamp inside the workshop. The bulb lit. For the first time, electricity created by one of the rebuilt windmills was powering something on the Carter farm. Ethan shouted for his father. Together, they watched the light glow while the windmill hummed outside. It was only one bulb, but to Ethan, it felt like proof that the entire system could work. Then the wind grew stronger. The tower began to shake. Ethan noticed the vibration too late. One of the blades was slightly heavier than the others, creating an imbalance that became more dangerous as the machine accelerated. A sharp metallic crack echoed across the yard. The shaft twisted. One blade tore loose and struck the side of the workshop. The remaining blades spun wildly before the entire assembly collapsed against the tower. The lamp went dark. For several seconds, Ethan stood frozen. Pieces of metal lay scattered across the wet ground. The generator housing had cracked. 2 days of careful assembly had been destroyed in less than a minute. By morning, the story had reached town. Someone had seen the broken blade beside the workshop. At the supply store, the farmers joked that Ethan's power station had lasted shorter than the blackout it was supposed to solve. Ethan did not respond. He returned to the wreckage and examined every damaged part. The wind had not defeated his idea. It had exposed its weaknesses. The tower was too flexible. The blades were poorly balanced. Most importantly, the machine had no way to slow itself when the wind became dangerous. Ethan opened his notebook and wrote beneath the original design, "Making power is not enough. The machine must survive the power that makes it." After the first windmill collapsed, Ethan stopped building. For several days, he did nothing but watch. He tied strips of cloth to fence posts, tree branches, the barn roof, and several points along the ridge. Some hung almost motionless. Others fluttered constantly, even when the air near the house felt still. That was when Ethan understood his first major mistake. He had treated the wind as though it moved evenly across the farm. It did not. The barn, trees, hills, and sheds all changed its direction. Some structures blocked it. Others forced it through narrow spaces, making it faster and more turbulent. A location that seemed convenient for construction was not necessarily a good place for a windmill. Ethan began recording what he saw. Every morning, afternoon, and evening, he walked the property with his notebook. He marked which ribbons moved, how strongly they pulled, and where the wind changed direction. He also built a simple measuring device from small cups, a bicycle bearing, and the counter from an old speedometer. It was not perfectly accurate, but it helped him compare one location with another. The results surprised him. The low field behind the workshop received irregular bursts of wind. That explained why the first machine had alternated between slow movement and violent acceleration. The ridge north of the barn was different. There, the wind was steadier. A narrow gap between two hills acted like a channel, guiding air across the property. Near an old line of trees, the airflow remained strong without becoming dangerously chaotic. Ethan changed his plan. Instead of building one large windmill beside the workshop, he would place several smaller machines wherever the wind was most reliable. Each would produce only part of the electricity the farm needed, but together they could create a more stable supply. He also redesigned the blades. He shortened them, balanced every piece by weight, and added a tail mechanism that could turn the rotor partly away from strong gusts. If one unit failed, the others could continue operating. His father studied the new drawings. So the windmill wasn't the real problem, he said. Ethan shook his head. We put it where it was easiest for us, not where the wind wanted it. For the next week, they moved the rebuilt tower toward the northern ridge. The neighbors thought Ethan was starting over. He was not. This time, he was letting the land tell him where the machine belonged. The second windmill did not look impressive. Its tower was shorter than the old machines scattered around town, and its blades were made from parts taken from 3 different farms. But when Ethan raised it on the northern ridge, it began turning with a smoothness the first machine had never achieved. For several hours he watched the meters inside the workshop. The voltage rose and fell, but it no longer jumped wildly. The current was small, yet steady enough to charge a row of second-hand batteries Ethan had cleaned, tested, and wired together. One windmill was still not enough. So Ethan built another, then another. Each machine was placed in a different part of the farm, where his measurements showed the wind behaved best. The units were connected through buried cables to a central control panel in the workshop. Ethan divided the system into priorities. The water pump came first. Without water, the animals could not last long. The ventilation fans came second, especially during hot summer days. The refrigeration units came third, protecting milk, vegetables, and medicine from spoiling. Lights, tools, and household appliances were placed at the bottom of the list. When the batteries were full, the system could power more. When energy was limited, it automatically fed only the equipment the farm needed most. At first, the wiring looked like a confusing web of colored cables, switches, and salvaged meters. Ethan labeled every connection by hand and built a simple panel that showed which windmill was producing power and which battery bank was receiving it. His father watched him test the system. "What happens if one stops working?" he asked. "The others keep charging," Ethan replied. "And if there's no wind? The batteries take over. And if the batteries run low, then the system shuts down everything except water and ventilation." This was no longer just a collection of repaired windmills. It was a network. One machine could fail without bringing down the entire farm. Each turbine shared the work, while the batteries stored electricity for calm hours and nighttime use. The first real test came during a short outage one evening. The farmhouse lights went dark, but seconds later, the water pump restarted. The fans inside the chicken house continued turning. The small refrigeration room stayed cold. Ethan stood beside the control panel, watching the battery meter fall slowly. For the first time, the farm had lost grid power without losing the systems that kept it alive. Outside, the windmills continued turning across the ridge. Separate pieces of abandoned metal had become something stronger because Ethan had taught them to work together. The storm arrived faster than anyone expected. By late afternoon, the sky above the Carter farm had turned almost black. Wind pushed across the fields in heavy waves, bending trees and throwing dust against the barn walls. Ethan stood inside the workshop, watching the meters on his control panel. The turbines were producing more power than usual, but he was not celebrating. Strong wind had destroyed his first machine. He knew that more energy also meant more danger. One by one, the tail mechanisms turned the windmills partly away from the strongest gusts. Their blades slowed instead of spinning out of control. The redesigned system was doing exactly what Ethan had built it to do. Then lightning flashed beyond the northern ridge. A second later, thunder shook the windows. The farmhouse lights flickered once, twice. Then the entire property went dark. Across the valley, lights disappeared from homes, barns, and roadside buildings. A fallen tree had pulled down the main power line, cutting electricity to most of the town. Inside the Carter workshop, the control panel clicked. The battery system took over. Within seconds, the water pump started again. Ventilation fans returned to life inside the chicken house. The refrigeration units continued humming in the storage room. Only the farmhouse lights remained off. Ethan had programmed the system to protect the farm's most important equipment first. His father entered the workshop carrying a flashlight. "Is it holding?" he asked. Ethan checked the meters. For now, the storm continued through the night. Rain struck the metal roof. Wind roared around the buildings. At times, one turbine slowed almost completely as its tail turned it away from a dangerous gust. The other units continued charging the batteries whenever conditions allowed. The system was not producing unlimited electricity. Every decision mattered. Ethan turned off unused equipment, checked the battery level each hour, and walked through the rain to inspect the towers from a safe distance. Near midnight, a truck stopped at the farm entrance. It was Mr. Dawson. His generator had failed, and the ventilation fans in his poultry barn had stopped. He needed to borrow fuel or find another source of power before the enclosed building became too hot and dangerous. Mr. Dawson stared past Ethan toward the ridge. Through the rain, the old windmill blades were still turning. The same machines he had once mocked were now keeping the Carter farm's water moving, animals breathing, and food cold. Behind him, the rest of the town remained dark, but the Carter farm was still alive. By morning, the storm had moved east. The rain had weakened, but the town was still without power. Utility crews said the damaged line might take another day to repair. At the Carter farm, the water pump was still running. The chicken house remained ventilated. The refrigeration room was still cold. News spread quickly. Mr. Dawson told another farmer that Ethan's system had survived the entire night. That farmer told someone at the supply store. Before noon, pickup trucks began appearing along the Carter driveway. The same neighbors who had laughed at the piles of rusted metal now stood beneath the northern ridge, staring at the windmills turning above them. They were not polished machines from a factory. Their blades did not match. Their towers had been patched and reinforced. Some parts still carried faded paint from the farms where they had once stood. But they worked. Ethan led the group into the workshop. He showed them the control panel, the battery bank, and the switches that directed electricity toward the farm's most important equipment. Mr. Miller pointed to one of the meters. "That machine came from my old windmill, didn't it?" Ethan nodded. "The shaft did. The blades came from another farm." Mr. Miller looked toward the ridge and fell silent. Mr. Dawson stood near the back of the room. Only one day earlier, he had needed help protecting his own poultry after his generator failed. Now he studied Ethan's handwritten labels and salvaged equipment with a different expression. "How much power does it make?" he asked. "Not enough for everything," Ethan answered, "but enough for what matters most." That sentence quieted the room. Ethan had not defeated the power company. He had not created endless electricity. He had built something more practical, a system designed around the farm's real needs. One farmer asked whether Ethan could repair an old windmill behind his barn. Another wanted to know how he had found the best location for each tower. A third offered Ethan 2 unused batteries and a box of electrical parts. The laughter was gone. In its place was curiosity, then respect. As the group stepped back outside, sunlight broke through the clouds. Across the wet fields, the windmill blades continued to turn. For years, the town had seen only broken machines. Now, for the first time, they saw the network Ethan had imagined long before anyone else believed it was possible. The town's electricity returned the following afternoon. One by one, lights came back on across the valley. Refrigerators restarted, pumps resumed working, and generators finally fell silent. At the Carter farm, almost nothing changed. The windmills continued turning. The batteries continued charging. The water pump, ventilation fans, and refrigeration room kept running exactly as they had during the outage. For Ethan, that was the real victory. His system had not been built to replace the electrical grid on ordinary days. It had been built to protect the farm when ordinary systems failed. Over the next several months, Ethan improved the network. He reinforced the towers, replaced worn bearings, and added simple shut-off mechanisms for severe weather. He expanded the battery bank and installed clearer meters so his family could see how much energy was being produced, stored, and used. He also kept the old diesel generator. But now it was the final backup, not the farm's first defense. People from neighboring farms began visiting Ethan for help. Some brought broken windmill parts. Others offered batteries, wire, metal, or equipment they no longer needed. Ethan did not build the same system for everyone. One farmer only needed emergency power for a well pump. Another wanted ventilation for a livestock barn. A third needed enough stored electricity to protect a small refrigeration room. Ethan taught them what the storm had taught him. Resilience did not mean producing unlimited energy. It meant knowing what had to survive. A year later, another powerful storm crossed the valley. The grid failed again. This time, several farms remained partially operational because of systems built from machines that had once been abandoned. From the Carter porch, Ethan watched points of light remain visible across the dark countryside. His father stood beside him. "Remember when everyone thought those windmills were junk?" he asked. Ethan smiled. They were junk when they were left alone. On the ridge, mismatched blades turned steadily beneath the clouds. The windmills had not become valuable because they were restored to their original form. They had become valuable because Ethan had given their surviving parts a new purpose. The town had mocked him for collecting broken machines. But Ethan had understood something they had missed. A farm did not need one perfect machine. It needed a system strong enough to keep going when one part failed. And from that night forward, when the valley went dark, the Carter farm never truly lost power again.